Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second roundtable of the migration story. Today, I'm really excited because this roundtable is all about reporters and what we do and how we do it. Having been one for the longest time, I'm really excited to have this conversation and share notes with everyone on this panel. I'm going to quickly introduce them. We have Aishwarya Mohanty, Nidhi Jamwal, Amoolya Rajappa, and Anima. All of them have written on migration, edited stories on migration, talked about migration. And we're just going to dive right into this to know what reporters do and how do they do it. How is reporting on migration different from any other story that you would look at as a reporter? Nidhi, do you want to start?
Thanks, Anuradha. I think when one is looking at story from migration perspective, I can do it from the perspective of men migrating, but I can also do it from the lens what happens when men migrate and the women are left behind because of that migration. How do they manage their families? What is the condition of their mental health? How do they manage their livelihoods? So I think you will get very different kind of story when you start looking at the same story but from a migration lens.
Yeah, that's true. That's something even I realized that every story we were doing, we were seeing that there was a migrant or a migration aspect to it. But because we were reporting it from different lenses, the focus was probably slightly different. How has it been for you, Aishwarya? How did your journey into, turning your lens towards this happen?
Migration was something that was like an inevitable part of the story that I would always report. If I'm reporting on sea erosion and we are talking about a village that doesn't exist anymore, we are talking about an entire village that has migrated from there. So for me, migration somehow was at the intersection of a lot of these stories that I was reporting on. But yes, when I started reporting on migration very specifically, what was different was this entire idea of calling a place your home, and how it is very different from them. They call that home, they call this home. So those interactions are very important, I think, and also for people who are reading it, for people who probably do not understand why it is so necessary for such a large section of people in India to migrate from one place to another, leaving behind their homes. So, I think that is how and what is different for me when I report on migration.
Anima?
Yeah. So I largely do stories on climate change impacts and energy transition. So migration would have, crept into the narrative structure of a story in a minimal way before that. But when you put the lens entirely on migration, the way of seeing a story itself changes. And it is not the journey itself. I'm more interested in seeing what the journey sets forth. It goes through phases. There are phases of, reservation and kind of grows into acceptance and assimilation or integration. So each of that kind of fascinates me because there are so many stories to be told. It is also a sign of how a society evolves. I also see the recording of migration story that way.
Amoolya, the last word to you on this.
Okay. For me, I think I don't know. Contrary to what everybody said, I think even from the start, I've always looked at okay, what's the migrant angle there? So I started off with migratory tribes in Karnataka, their languishing vocations, and as I gathered momentum, as I continued doing it, I think what staggeringly emerged was how nuanced this topic is, as to the different corridors, the different push factors, pull factors. So yes, I mean, yeah, I've just gotten better with it, but then I've always had a natural this thing to report on the migration side of things.
That's really interesting to know. And also, you brought up this fact that it is a very nuanced story to tell. So, one of the things that I struggle with a lot, continue to every time I go reporting, and I had recently gone reporting December end to Gujarat, and I realized that, the questions I have in my head are particularly the ethical challenges seem to persist even though I have been doing this for so many decades. And one of the things that I always struggle is that I always see myself as an outsider
how much ever I tell myself about the importance of why this story needs to be told, I do still very honestly grapple with the challenge of am I being true to their story? And the second part of it being, do I really need to tell their story? Or should I just give them more agency to be able to tell their own stories?
Yeah, so I think all of us struggle with this kind of these questions in our head every time we go to do a story. But I think this is a struggle we face because I know if tomorrow somebody comes to my home and asks me, how much do you earn? Which one of the panelists was saying that, where do your kids study? Kitna padhe hain? Kitna khate hain? Ye karte hain. Those are the questions nobody can ask me, or I will never answer those questions possibly. But that these are exactly the kind of questions we go and ask them. I think one of the ways how I see addressing that issue is that because in the past couple of years, I have spent time working with community journalists and building their capacities. And I strongly believe that now that we are all senior journalists, I think we should also spend time in training youth or people from the migrant workers community, if I can say it like that, so that they are able to capture and tell their own stories. Now you have smartphones, mobile phones, you have multimedia. I think it's easier for them to function because you don't expect them to write good English or Hindi and send their stories. So I think we must build capacities and build a community like this. I think that would really, really be important and do justice to what we are trying to do.
Yeah, I totally agree on that, and also I think by default, a little bit of it also is happening because, you have social media, which gives people a platform to start, saying things they want, directly talking about things that matter to them. But yeah, I hear you. Aishwarya?
Yeah, so these questions that we were talking about, I mean, whenever we sit with a person, from their name to everything, the age, how many people are there in the family, we want to know everything. And I think these questions are important because that's how we can tell their stories right. So even these very, very basic, minute details are important for us. And one thing I have realized over time is now that when I sit with people, when I do a focus group discussion sort of a thing, and they ask me that what will happen after the story is published, like what's going to happen. So to break the ice, now I have started sharing some information from my end also, like where do I come from? What do I do? How many people are there in my family? And some personal anecdotes. Whenever I have to ask a question, I share those anecdotes with them so that they feel comfortable that yes, probably we can do that chit chat and share a bit more. So that happens. And so one incident I would like to share. This was the very first story that I did for Migration Story. It was about how men are not getting brides in this village where there's coastal erosion. So while doing the story, people were initially apprehensive that why are you doing the story, this and that. And finally, towards the end, they asked me if I'm married. And I said yes. And in Odia, they said, Bonchi gala, matlab, you're saved. Otherwise, we would have stopped you here. So, but in that moment, I could understand that how difficult it is for them because for me, it's a story. I report it, I'll come back, I'll write, it'll get published. For them, it's a living experience. I mean, they're experiencing it every day. It's a reality that they're living every day. So for them, it is way too much difficult to sit down and share everything and not know that what's going to come out of it. So
I totally relate to what you're saying. Given I realize that and maybe it's also, with age and experience, that I am telling people so much about myself as well, answering so many questions from, how many kids do you have? Why this? Why not that? And, earlier as a younger reporter, I would be more business-like about my work, like I would answer, but it would still be like this is a work. But like now I'm just realizing that I have so much of just talking, and as a result, I realize I spend way longer on field and I'm always being rushed by the cab driver to say you're going to miss some flight. Time is up. Let's go. But Anima, what is your experience? Are you also sharing all your dreams and aspirations and life?
It's kind of difficult, like that's, I think, one thing we have all agreed upon that none of us want to kind of share. much of our stories, but we want to kind of glean as much as we can from the other end. So for me, I think, I kind of make peace with the fact that I am the intruder in the scenario. So I kind of work on that ground. I'm mindful of that. I have approached them for the story. They have not come to me. It is a favor that they are doing to me by telling me their story. So I kind of abide by two things, like consent, like getting their consent on what I'm trying to do here, give them as elaborate a brief as possible on the story I'm trying to do, especially when it comes to clicking pictures or taking short videos, and then telling that story as authentically as possible. It is like telling that story without making any judgments. So that would be the focus areas.
Amoolya?
So for me, I think the bottom line is to make sure that telling their story will not jeopardize the work of people who are already employed at the lowest rung of like supply chains. I think as long as that is taken care of, I'm always talking about myself. To give you an example, I think once I was reporting from North Karnataka, I was talking to a Lambani woman about her traditional embroidery work. And it was a very harmless quote in the story that actually got me into trouble, where she explained that, this doesn't pay us much, but we do it because this kind of work is available for us all throughout the year. The story was published and everything, and the next day the employer calls me saying, "But you haven't mentioned about the benefits we give them." And then so I felt very helpless being in Bangalore, and then not being able to ensure that the person who gave me the interview was safe, her livelihood was safe, secured. So these things are pretty tricky. Yeah, we have to be, our onus as a journalist doubles up, mostly because we're reporting with migrant workers who belong to very extremely vulnerable populations.
I think related to this whole issue, I also wanted to maybe, ask other, fellow journalists. One major issue that I face whenever I'm in the field to do a story, if I'm speaking to migrant workers and all, they always say, "Isse kya fayda hoga?" Because people are also tired that reporters come and they ask all kind of questions, people answer all those questions, and then nothing happens. So that's a question I still haven't figured after 2 decades, that how does one answer that question. So I don't know, just like to others, that how do they handle this kind of question if it comes.
Aishwarya?
Yeah, so I also get this question a lot. At the back of your mind, when as a journalist you're doing a story, the idea is that, there should be a change at a policy level, at least a dialogue, a conversation around this. Again, all of us in our careers have done stories where this has happened. There have been changes. So even if out of 100 there have been two, but there have been two. Whenever they have this question, I tell them that I cannot assure you that something will happen, but there is a chance that it might. So the idea is that the story needs to be told, even if it has to be told twice, thrice, or a number of times. Maybe we should keep telling the story until that thing happens. So I don't know how convinced they are with this, but this is how I did a documentary from Sonbhadra where we actually took the shot of the woman saying that a lot of people like you have come here and nothing happens. You just take shots and nothing. And we wanted to include that in the documentary because we thought that it was important because we don't know if something will happen after this documentary. So yeah, I think that's how I take it.
No, that's true. And if all of us here are largely writing in a language and in publications that they actually don't have access to. So this idea of how are you going to take the story back, or if they sometimes be like, "Ye kahan chhapega?" That again is a difficult question to answer. Translation is another big, issue to deal with. But Anima, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you get asked that question, but I also find that there are also they're also equally keen to tell their stories as well. They might ask the question, but they will nevertheless tell you the story too. So it is like, I think generally every reporting experience is like that. It has it's a push and pull all the time. So I tell them that maybe my story may not do much to your individual state, but nevertheless it's important to tell it. And when you kind of share the story with them when it is out, there is that happiness, okay, and there is that sharing within that community of theirs that this has come. So it is not it may not be a very tangible kind of change that comes their way at the end of it, and there may not be a shift in their condition, but it's about telling that story at that given point in time.
Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
मी पुण्याची आहे.
टी स्टेट मुनाबाड़ी,
बिहार से सुपौल जिला, मिजोरम, आसम.
हमारा गांव जोधपुर राजस्थान है.
And this is the migrationstory.com.
India's first dedicated migration newsroom that will bring you the stories of men and women who build and clean our homes,
Cook and deliver our meals.
offer care services and stitch our clothes,
They are everywhere, yet
invisible. Read, listen, and watch the challenges and aspirations of India's 140 million people who travel thousands of kilometers away from their homes in search of better lives.
in this podcast, we bring you stories of their incredible journeys, offer a peek into their culture, music, and food, and conversations that explain, engage, and inform. Stay tuned.
Sometimes you're the first person who has actually taken time to ask them anything. And I think sometimes that gives them the agency that they have not had, because you just stopped by and said, okay, can you tell me everything? Like, including the small things, like what are you cooking? What is in that dabba? What is in your bag? It does sound intrusive, but I have had somebody tell me once that, nobody ever asked me that. But having said that, and all of us write so much, we report on this so much, what is something that really brings you all joy in doing this? And what is the one thing that is like really disheartening about telling these stories for so long? Anima?
I think it is storytelling that drives us, isn't it? Because it will sound very cliched when I say it, but having been a journalist for a considerable period of my life, and then I went into something else for an interim, the only thing I missed was that act of writing and that act of storytelling. And it is not about agency to you, but it is also about telling stories of people who are so disconnected from you in so many different ways. And it is also about opening all those small windows which you don't have access to otherwise. So I think it is a sheer pleasure of storytelling. Maybe the stories may be dark and the stories may be very discouraging, but I don't necessarily see it as black and white. There is so much of gray in there, and nothing kind of teaches you about any particular phenomena, situation, like doing a story on it. And considering that we are all kind of not specialists in anything, doing so many different things, I think that is the quickest way I understand a situation, is by telling a story.
That's actually really nicely put. I think we all are like, the storytelling is at the heart of everything we do. How is it for you, Aishwarya?
So for every story, I make sure that I do go on the ground and I just don't do a telephonic conversation. And I think when you're on the ground, when you're sitting with them in their village or in their house, talking to them firsthand, a lot of things change for you also. The thoughts that you've probably had, or the way you think about a certain thing. For me, journalism in general has helped me shed a lot of prejudices. It has made me more empathetic and grounded in what I think and how I think. And I think these stories, or just beyond that stories, we do a 1200 word stories, but the experience that we come back with, if we start writing that entire thing, it will run into 5,000 words, because there's so much more that you learn from the ground. And that is something that no college, no school, I think, will teach you ever. But just talking to those people and conversations that are not even brought up in your own house, maybe. So you tend to learn that there. And there have been reporting trips where I've taken my family along, like my brother or my mother, for them to firsthand see what I am seeing. They'll read it, it'll be different. But for them to see it firsthand, to visualize it and understand it there, would be very different. So that's how I share my experience at times with my family. And I think that is also very crucial.
I'm going to hold on to that thought, Aishwarya. I'm going to come back to it, but I'm going to let Nidhi jump in and then Amoolya.
Voice of the poor and all of that is it's important, but it's secondary. What drives me is that curiosity bit. How are people doing it? How is somebody living in that? If climate change is happening, how would they be managing it? So I think it's trying to understand that which makes me travel, which makes me meet people, sit with them, try and understand from them. And a lot of times when we visit rural India, and I'm sure all of us have experienced, where people would always say, you've studied from the good universities, आप तो कॉलेज से पढ़े लिखे, आपको तो सब जानकारी है, हम लोग तो बेवकूफ हैं. And every time I have sat with them, I've sat with those women who are possibly unlettered, the kind of things one learns, like Aishwarya said, you would not learn it anywhere. Your parents will not be able to teach you. No university, no degree will be able to teach you. So I think it is that hunger for knowledge, for that curiosity, that I think that's something which is very, very important for me. And I think that doesn't let me get bored or think that, okay, maybe it's 25 years, it's too much now, put the boots down. But I think and I think we're very lucky we live in a country which is so diverse that we can never run out of stories and story ideas.
That is so true. In fact, when we started the migration story, and we're recording this on Jan 6th, and Jan 7th of 2024 is when the website sort of launched. And, Roli and I constantly were trying to think of, how do we sustain it, etc. And the one question that uniformly we would get asked, and it was amazing that we were being asked this question every time we went to ask somebody for funding or to talk about our portal, would be like, are there so many stories to tell? Like, how will you? And even when we were just 1 week old, or even not before launching also, we were so confident that we would have 365 days of storytelling if we could, and we would have it for years, because that many stories are there to tell. And in the 1 year we've just scratched like the tiny surface of it. But Amoolya has had a part in some of those stories. So Amoolya, how is your what drives you to tell these stories and want to tell more?
I think it's the power of narrative. Some narratives just stay with you. And I think reporting is one of the most, reiterating what everybody just shared, it's one of the most humbling experiences ever. The more you do it, the more akin you be, it's just part of you. It becomes part of you. But I think for me, it's the sheer joy of collecting diverse, varied, powerful, moving, sometimes haunting narratives. At the heart of it is also giving them visibility. It's not like they're incapable of telling their own stories. We're only amplifying it for them through better technologies, in different media platforms, media forms, etc. The power of narratives and the fact that it's the most humbling experience ever. I think that's what drives me to do more and more migration-related reportage.
It is true. You do learn so much, and then you're like, oh, I didn't know this. And then you're like, oh, but I thought I'd done my homework. Oh, but then I didn't know that. That is like just the story of my life. Every time I go on reporting and come back, my notebooks are full with things I did not know, though I had spent so much time trying to know before I went. But that's true. But Aishwarya, I'm very curious to know what your mother thought when she was on the ground.
So this was a story for another portal, and I was reporting on sea erosion and how this entire village doesn't exist anymore. This is in Ganjam. So we have this conversation around environment, climate change, and everything. This is happening, that is happening. So I asked my mother and brother to tag along, that please come with me to see what has happened because of it. So to make them stand and to look at these houses which are like partially broken, people not living there anymore, I made them talk to the people. So more than the questions that I had for my story, they had so many questions to ask them. What happened, how and what, and all of this. So they were very curious. And my brother specifically, he was very curious to understand and know. So when you come back from there, then you probably can tell them that, this is happening because of certain practices that even we do, which are environmentally degrading. So we bring about that changes in our own daily lives. So so I tend to do that. I've taken my mother to other places also where she can see in person, just in front of her eyes, what is happening and how is it happening. And if we can bring in some changes maybe in our own lives to help them better, not directly, but indirectly even. So that has been the idea. And even for the audience, I think the idea is that your stories should help them not just be sympathetic, but to understand that it is a human aspect also. To understand that behind every, say, a policy debate or a statistic that we are sharing, There are people with dreams, aspirations, and a reality that they're living every day, which is very far from what we can imagine sitting in our comfortable homes. So it's very important for them to connect. And I think storytelling and reporting, authentic reporting through that lens is crucial in this aspect. Yeah.
That's nice. Also it helps people around you understand what you do and why you're doing it. So I think for the first story, for the migration story portal, and it was all like deadline, and what is the story and no photographs. So I took my daughter, who is studying photography in school, and I was like, you be my photographer. So the first few pictures, the first original pictures on the migration story were clicked by Sarayu. And I think it also gave her a sense, because firstly, she was like, how can you just talk to people? Like, you're just walking into their homes and talking to them. And then just the idea of framing and consent, I think, like, I really notched it up there. I think that was the one experience where she was like, oh, so this is what it is, and these are the stories. And I think it changed her. And, that's what we also hope with our readers, when they read it or when they listen to something that works. But for you, Anima, like, how do you sort of get a sense of if your story has traveled? How do you sort of get a sense that, okay, this has worked and it will sort of, people who read it will get it?
For me, when I did the story for Migration Story, like two things stood out for me, like two insights that were given by talking heads. One was a teacher who was working with children from classes 1 to 4 who were children of migrant workers. And she said, language is not the barrier here. It is the attitude of the people, number one. And number two, it was by a migration a scholar who has been working on migration for like 20, 30 odd years. And he said, especially from Kerala perspective, we should not think that migrant laborers need us. We need them equally. Okay, it is a very two-way relationship. It is not like there is no skewed dynamic here. And when you go to Kerala, especially from Kerala, from the perspective of a Kerala society, you will find that a lot of these blue-collar jobs are now performed by migrant workers, because there is this paucity of labor when it comes to Kerala. So the way a native of Kerala sees them has to change. So even if it was not consciously, may not have tried to do that, but I would have wanted those two messages to travel, to be more sensitive, to be more welcoming, and to kind of understand that we need them as much as they need us. Even if in a small way it could kind of make them think, to kind of change perspective, then the story would be successful.
That's true. We have so much of social media and everything, but it is becoming increasingly difficult to gauge how your story has traveled. Even though there are all these platforms, I think it's actually become more difficult, because you really don't know if somebody has actually engaged with your story or not. That is a challenge.
And also there is this pressure to kind of either make it black or white, so that is also kind of, you really don't know how it has impacted. Yeah.
That's so true. Amoolya, how about you? What is your experience of telling stories, and what you hoping they will do as they travel?
For me, I think it's again to do with visibility. I hope in a very minuscule way, at least through the reporting, the kind of reporting we do, people come to truly understand, appreciate, acknowledge the role that migrant workers play in keeping our communities running, especially urban economies running. Our economies would collapse without their services. So, for example, the 2024 water crisis in Bangalore. So, how does every unique urban problem impact migrant workers in complex and compounded ways? So, for them, I think most of them live in overcrowded shanties which have no access to piped water supply. So, how is it different for them? And then there was another report about immunizations. India has had a huge dip in routine immunization of children. So in that case, how is it impacting migrant workers? Because often they end up receiving crucial vaccines in different places other than their birthplace. So I think pegging it with current trends, and then so to understand, okay, how is this problem compounded for migrant workers?
ஒரு கிலோ மாம்பழம் எவ்வளோப்பா? எங்கே எடு?
ಇವತ್ತು ಯಾವ ಮೀನಿದೆ?
पक्का फ्रेश ಇದೆಯಾ ಭಯ್ಯ 2 कुल्लत चाय देना
Street vendors are an essential part of the modern day imagination of urban India. But street vendors are not just a modern phenomenon. Throughout history, whether in the United States, Japan, or South and Southeast Asia, street vendors have played a crucial role as agents of commerce, also profoundly influencing our cultural habits. Hello and welcome to L is for Labor, your source of information for all things labor.
Only on the migrationstory.com.
I think one of my first editors told me that, why should somebody care? And if you can weave in that, why should you care, as in terms of the reader or whoever is consuming your content, if you can even do that with a sentence or a paragraph on why this matters to you as much as it matters to the people we are writing about. I think, I think you articulated it well with your examples. And as we wrap up, I did want to ask, there are so many stories to tell. There are a whole bunch of things that happen. There is this whole conversation around collaborative reporting. Going forward, at some point, do you think there is the idea of collaborating with the people whose stories we are telling? Is that something that can happen? And how do you imagine it happening? If you think it's something that would, enhance this storytelling better, do you think that'll be the case? Could be the case, rather.
No, I think that should be the case. I'll give an example. A video story that I'm working on for the migration story. I've already collaborated with a local reporter in Uttar Pradesh. So both of us are putting it together. One point is, when we are doing these stories, if you are doing from our cities, it's fine. We step out, we can do those stories. Now, Aishwarya, Nidhi, Anima, all of us, we can't travel all the time to all the places and record these stories, which is why it's very important for us to build capacities, agencies of people who belong to these communities. They know the language, they know the culture. When they are migrating, possibly they are also migrating, so they can actually capture that journey as well as part of the story. So I think how I see is that as I move ahead as an independent journalist, I will be collaborating more and more with these community journalists with whom I have been working for the past 5 years, and see to it, maybe if they cannot work on a text story, can I work with them on a video story, because some of them are very good with videos. So I think that's how I see it. Definitely for me, the way ahead is to collaborate with local rural reporters, so that in the process I learn, they learn, and I think we are able to do better stories.
That's true. And also maybe stories from more regions and more micro regions as well. Expand the spaces from where these stories are being told. Aishwarya, Amoolya, what are your thoughts on newer ways of telling these stories?
I'll actually second what Nidhi had said, because I feel if I am traveling to a place to do a story, the maximum time I can spend is 1 day, 2 days, 7 days. If I'm doing a story, like I'm traveling in the morning, returning at night, those people know that I'm coming. They'll probably put on their best clothes. They'll leave their chores behind and sit with me to talk. So I don't know their life as it is. I know from what they're saying, but I'm not visualizing it. I'm not experiencing it. But for somebody who's seeing that every day, probably somebody from the village, if they come out and tell the story, I think it will be even more nuanced. There'll be so much more that they can share. There'll be so much more that they can tell. There was this recent exhibition where it was by Dakshin, and there are these fisherwomen from Odisha who were trained to do photography, and they captured their own lives, and those photographs were so amazing, so amazing. Well, you cannot even imagine. Like, I'll probably take a few photographs and come back. But they were doing this documentation for so long, and those images were so amazing. The images in itself had so much to tell. We did not even need captions for those. So I think when they are empowered to tell their stories, there's so much more that can come out than what probably all of us can do.
Adding on, I mean, I totally agree with what everybody has said. I think building rapport with rural communities, also equipping migrant workers to share their own stories. And I think that's happening at many levels. At least from my research work, I can say that, smartphones, newer technologies have enabled them to be better equipped to. And we saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. There were these shoddily short WhatsApp circulated short videos where they were complaining of shortages, and journalists made like great use of them to like report on shortages. And then the civil society was very quick to pick up those videos and mobilize help and everything. But something, speaking specifically about collaboration, something that I did not do before, but I'm much more mindful and I'm benefiting from that, is my collaborations with the civil society in itself. Like, NGOs working with migrant workers. I think the trust building is much easier. They don't have to trust me directly. They trust these people because they work with them every day. They take them to the Anganwadi to vaccinate their kids. They're constantly telling them about weather forecasts. So I think when I enter through a civil society, this thing, I think it's much more easier. I already have an upper hand in knowing many socio demographic details, and then I sit with them for a good amount time to warm up, and then do the then introduce my story and why am I here and everything. So I think building key partnerships with civil society is also a good way of going ahead. I mean.
So, has your work on migration really shifted your own understanding of belonging, home, identity? And I know Aishwarya sort of started a little bit with this idea of home.
Yes, so this entire idea of calling a place home, like, would you call this place home where you come back once in a year, where probably you have your wife and your children? But would you call that place home where you have learned cooking because you have to cook yourself and eat, where you have to come back after a day's work? So for them, this reality is in transition, and also their identities. So like we did this story around the last story that we did of migration from Ganjam to Surat and the entire idea of caste, and how it is different for them in their village and how it is different there. There, they're probably struggling every day, but when they come back here with a new soap, a new shirt on, it's different for them. People look at them differently. But when they go back, it's the grinding again that happens there because they have to work. There's somebody who's constantly probably shouting at them that this is not happening right, that is not happening right. They don't know what they'll eat. They don't know when they'll go to sleep. These are the things that make me think also that how and what are the perspectives that we are probably missing and how we can bring those in as well. So so this entire idea of how identity and home and the reality is constantly in transition is what makes me probably want to tell these stories even more.
Yeah, I think what it has, like I said earlier also, what it has done to me is it's made me really realize that I am also a migrant, which, to be very honest, I never used to look at me from that perspective. And I think as migrants, all of us have struggled in a life. Now, when I'm doing a story, I'm speaking to some people, whether it's children, women, men, a lot of things when they say it, it reminds me of my struggle. Maybe when I left a very, very small town in Jammu Kashmir, moved to Delhi for my college, and all those years of struggle of trying to save 1 rupee in bus ticket and all of that. So I think it just personalizes all those stories that now as a journalist you do because you've had a journey of your own. I think it helps you do justice to these stories because you can feel those things.
Yeah, Aishwarya?
So I just had a point to add that working on migration has also made me think deeply about privilege because so for some identity and like we're talking about home, they are choices which they can navigate freely. But for many others, they're actually shaped by survival and necessity. So the understanding is that identity isn't fixed. It keeps evolving with your experiences that you have. So that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, true. Privilege is a concern. Anima?
I'm also a migrant. I see myself as a migrant. And, that is, certain migrations are spurred by ambition and hope, and certain others are spurred by circumstances. It's driven by despair. So you see the similarities and you see the differences. And again, it is a nuance that you understand better to make those journeys without the safety nets that you had. So that is a revelation. And the idea of home, like I would slightly differ from all of you there. For me, like somehow, it may be a very abstract idea. It's an abstract also, because home is also an idea, or it's like, it's what you link to memories. So it's like, I think, close to 20 years in Delhi, but home is still Kerala for me. So when I kind of even met the protagonists for my stories, and we bonded on that, because they spent 15 years in Calicut, but home was Berhampur. So I'm like, yeah, I get that. So for them, home is about not buying a house in Calicut, but building a house in Berhampur. So it is, especially among the first generation migrant workers, once they have children and the children grow up in this particular milieu, they might have a slightly different take. But, I think that is a story of migrations across the world, like the ties are so much stronger and the pull so much harder to resist when you are a first generation migrant. So yes, so home is kind of fixed for me, but so where to my protagonist. But yeah, again, you are mindful of all those things that you have, and which the disadvantages that they are working from. So yes.
True. The home question is a big question which will need another hour, because I have a lot to say, which I'm not going to. But Amoolya, last word to you.
Well, I mean, this is a fascinatingly thought-provoking question. We can go on and on about this. But I mean, so to say, my understanding of like identity, home, whatever, belonging has definitely evolved with my evolved during or whatever through my work on migration. It might sound more personal than I intended to, but then definitely this is something I reflect on quite often. Right now, my husband and I are in the process of rebuilding our his ancestral home in Bangalore. So when people ask me like whether it gives me a sense of like this gives us a sense of security, stability, my honest answer is like sorry, but no. I mean, not really. In fact, it brings more anxiety than reassurance. Like for me, home is less about being. It's less about being a physical space. It's more to do with a sense of being rooted. And I don't know, paradoxically, much like the migrant workers we report on, meet, interact, I think my life also now feels rooted in rootlessness, like, with all the emotions that come with it, of course. So in a way, my frequent travels within, outside India, and obviously combined with my few years of whatever studying and reporting on migration, they've all really shaped my perspective of what home really means. And something that I also otherwise have realized in the recent past is that I'm always more excited about returning home than leaving it. So each homecoming gives me the chance to sort of reflect why I feel more connected to a certain place than the others. And this is the same with migrant workers. So I gain a deeper understanding of how belonging is shaped by movement and memory and experience rather than just the geography. And then I think every reporting experience sort of teaches you and reaffirms that as the more you do it.
Thank you so much. I think that sort of summed up a lot of what all of us have been trying to say quite nicely. And, I hope this year brings more nuanced storytelling. I think nuance is the word, at least in the sense of telling stories of migrations. I really appreciate all of you taking so much of time, and to more stories.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava.
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
And this is The Migration Story.